I'm Young Kim again. I think our first panel is on a new political economy of the COVID-19 era. Our first speaker is Professor Yong-Ho Cho. How are you, Professor Cho? I think we met in Germany a few years ago, right?
See you
Very
again.
glad to see you again. Professor Cho, we talk about COVID-19 and government trust in South Korea.
Thank you for inviting me here in this wonderful conference. I'm very pleased to share some of my research to this wonderful audience. Normally, when I write a paper, I am very restricted in terms of drawing implications. But when I present, I speak more than the paper. So I'd like to share some of my view about my paper. Would you like full screen, please? Yes. So my paper is about the decline of government trust during the late Moon Jae-in administration through panel data analysis. Using this paper, I wanted to reveal some inner part of Korean politics. This is approval rating of the Moon Jae-in administration. Moon Jae-in administration started with 84 approval rate during his honeymoon period, and then his approval rating started to decline. And then 2018, his approval rating was 83%, which is pretty high when he met Kim Jong-un. And then his approval rating declined. And then certainly 2020, especially January and February, the first Chinese woman affected by COVID-19, she came to South Korea and COVID-19 started to spread. In early period of the COVID-19, Korean government was criticized a lot because opposition party, the 국민의힘 in Korea, 국민의힘 criticized Moon Jae-in administration not to block Chinese people. And then suddenly, the Korean COVID-19 policy was becoming successful. Government approval rating skyrocketed, and then Moon Jae-in government decided to distribute government subsidy. And then 2020, the National Assembly election, legislative election, the ruling party swallowed 180 seats, which was, the big landsliding victory in Korean history. And then certainly, turning to the summer and autumn of 2020, Moon Jae-in government approval rating declined. And then I tried to investigate why Moon Jae-in government approval rating up and down, especially declined steeply last year and early this year. Government trust is always important because government trust is a component of social capital enabling government to solve problems of community. Government solve many problems when citizens have high political trust. However, government face citizen resistance and do just the regular things when citizens are skeptical of their government. Therefore, president must implement their prioritized policies during their honeymoon period, and then they needed to be restricted in response to citizens' political trust. As you saw, government trust about Moon Jae-in administration is pretty up and down, up and down. Within short period, it went down and steeply up. This is one part of dynamic Korean politics. I had a motivation for this paper. Since early 2000, Korean politics has been ideologically politicized. Even regionalism has been also politicized. So government performance is not subjectively evaluated among ideological supporters, either progressive or conservatives. However, a large number of citizens tend to evaluate, actually they try to actively evaluate government performance in an objective manner. This is why Korean politics is very, very dynamic, in some sense unstable, by showing Koreans' hot-tempered disposition. I personally see this cultural trait of Koreans as a source of Korean development. Because ideological anchors are not less socially and psychologically embedded into Koreans' individual than Western ones. For example, as Ambassador Lee Tae-sik mentioned, racism and religion are socially embedded and individually psychologically embedded in the United States. And leftist and rightist ideology are very strong. They have very strong social root. However, South Korea does not have, strong religious attachment, ideological, underpinnings. Therefore, Korean people tend to evaluate government performance in a very active way. In the United States, partisanship is stable. They call a moved mover of politics. Partisanship also changed, varied in Korea in response to government performance. So I had 5 research questions. For example, how do Korean citizens evaluate government policies? Do they adjust government trust on the basis of their evaluation? What policies affect their trust most? Are they specific or general policies? Normally, political trust scholars argue that it is economic policies or corruptions, but I would say there's a specific policies that affect government trust among Koreans. Especially, I would like to emphasize housing policy in Korea over the last, a couple of years. What implications does it this in-depth study make? There are competing theories to explain government trust in terms of levels and changes. For example, political partisan models indicate citizens trust their government when they belong to winning or ruling parties, and their ideology is close to government. And their second theory of social and cultural model, middle and upper class citizens are likely to trust the government because they receive more benefit than those of lower class and marginal classes. So those of high life satisfaction and social trust are likely to trust the government. This is called spillover effect. People who feel, well, they look up government and then they show trust. This is spillover effect. And there's a third model of performance evaluation, which is the theoretical basis of this study. According to this theory, citizens assess government policies and then they decide whether they continue to trust the government or stop. I believe this performance evaluation is primary in the way Koreans see government, rather than partisanship or religious attachment, other factors. So theories are wonderful. However, empirical research of Korea is still short in terms of determining what government policies affect citizens' updating of their political trust. Because the absence of panel data, all the existing research employs cross-national survey at a single time point, and they show correlational differences across independent variables rather than causal change. So I wanted to show how government trust changed among Korean citizens from summer of 2020 to springtime of 2021. So I was the PI of this survey, this panel survey. I and my colleagues surveyed 45 respondents in the summer of 2020. And then I continued to survey 1832 respondents in spring 2020. So I used regression analysis. Dependent variable is government trust. And I chose 3 independent variables: citizens' evaluation of COVID-19, economic policy, and real estate policy. So first result I would like to present is government trust change. Summer of 2020, from the first survey, 60% of Koreans, they stated they trust the government. And the 40% shows distrust. And then the second survey shows 42% stayed, they did not change their trust. And 35% of 40% of the first survey, they did not change their stance. However, 4% changed from distrust to trust. And 19% changed from trust to distrust. So on average, 14% decline was observed from summer of 2020 and spring of 2021. So even pretty short period, the change is pretty dynamic. And second result, how citizens evaluate 3 main policies: COVID-19, economy, and real estate, 부동산, housing policy. People positively evaluate COVID-19. 70% were positive about COVID-19 in terms of how government handled this issue. And economic issue, there's a half and half. 46% were negative and 34% positive. But in terms of, when it comes to real estate policy, housing policy, 70% of Koreans were very, very negative about government policy. 17% were positive, 13% were neutral. And then I wanted to test how this evaluation of 3 government policies affect government trust change. And then citizen evaluation of 3 government policies and trust change. The COVID-19 policy was not that big in this descriptive bar graph. When it comes to economic policy, those who negatively evaluate government policy of economy, they are likely to change from trust to distrust. When it comes to real estate policy, those who negatively evaluate real estate policy, they change their trust from they change their attitude from trust to distrust. So there's a positive relationship between citizens' evaluation of real estate policy and attitude change from trust to distrust. And then I took regression analysis. Here's orange color shows significant variables, which means COVID-19 policy and economic policy and real estate policy. They are highlighted by, colored by orange color. So so the correlation coefficient of these three variables shows significant level, and then ideology, partisanship affected the change of government trust. What factors affected the most? And result 5 shows impact of independent variables. According to this graph, real estate policy is the biggest impact, biggest factor that contributed to negative attitude of citizens toward the government. And then from summer of 2020 and spring of 2021, and those supporters other than ruling Democratic Party, they were detached from Moon Jae-in government. And other social economic factors didn't matter. And I also tested how policy evaluation affected government trust, distrust actually, among three generations, from young generation and middle-aged class, middle-aged generation, and old generations. Among the young generations, economy was the most important factor, and middle-aged class, real estate issue is number one primary issue, and then COVID-19 policy was the second biggest issue. And old generation, both economic issue and real estate issue affected the government distrust a lot. And then I also tested the relationship between policy evaluation and government trust decline among three classes: upper class, middle class, and lower class. It is very interesting that real estate issue didn't matter much among lower class Koreans. However, real estate issue was the biggest issue among upper class Koreans. This graph shows those of lower class, it seems that they gave up in terms of buying houses. However, because those of upper class, they have apartment, houses, they got angry with Moon Jae-in administration's housing policies. So now I come to some conclusions, implications. For example, Korean citizens evaluate government policy to decide whether to update their political trust, which is good for accountability. Especially government trust among citizens tend to fluctuate depending on how government copes with salient issues such as real estate policy, which is pretty, new issue. Actually, over the last 4 years, housing prices has been doubled. So young people and those of lower class people, I think they give up. They lost their expectation about their, future. They purchase house and they, form family members. I think they gave up, I think. And Korean citizens pay attention to both salient issues, real estate, the COVID-19. This is, direct conclusion from the empirical result. And they also, value general issues like economy. So in Korea, how high political interest and active evaluation of government policies make Korean politics dynamic as well as unstable. When it comes to keynote speech of Ambassador Lee Tae-sik, he said Korean democracy is also in crisis. However, I think there's two factors can stop this deconsolidation of Korean democracy. One is Koreans actively evaluate government. The other one is Korean presidential term is only one term. When it comes to the first, issue, Koreans critically evaluate government policies, how it affects Korean politics. It's like, Korean politics is swing. If I may exaggerate from these results, I would say Korean politics follows pendulum motion by two variables, government performance and partisanship. Although partisanship does not have strong, deep root, but when people actively evaluate government, they change their partisanship. Therefore, Korean politics, follow this movement. So this cultural trait, active evaluation of government performance, sometimes they expected a lot and they frustrated a lot. This is the positive and negative side. For example, positive side, it threatened Korean government to work hard and make it accountable. On the other hand, it has a negative consequence. For example, it is related to convergence, instability, and improvisational response rather than pluralistic, liberal, tolerant, programmatic development of Korean politics. This paper has a limitation. For example, this study did not cover narrow number, double standard, and political morality of sexual scandals. For example, Seoul mayor and Busan mayor, they stopped their career because of sexual problem, which are getting serious among elite because the government trusted the object of rational as well as a moral assessment. So now I stop. Thank you.